Well, good evening everyone, and thanks very much for coming to the Viva Energy Gas Terminal Community Meeting. I'm Jo Powell and I'm the Energy Hub Engagement Manager, and we're really pleased to have you here tonight so we can really focus on safety. But before I get started, I'd like to begin by paying my respects to the traditional custodians of the land where we are here tonight, and that's the people of the Wadawurrung people, and I pay my respects to them past, present and emerging. Also like to do a little bit of housekeeping. The toilets are at the back and there's no alarm practices scheduled tonight, but if the alarm does sound, we will meet out in the foyer in the car park. So we'll go out there and that will be the assembly point. Tonight is being filmed and photographed, and that's really to allow other people who can't be here tonight to watch the video online. So please let us know if you don't want to be photographed, and we'll ensure that that picture is not published. So this is our fourth community session that we've had on the gas terminal. And we have heard that safety is really, really important. So we've decided tonight to focus on safety, and we will be wanting your input. So we'll ask throughout the night to please ask questions. If you don't want to raise your hand, there's also cards on the table, and please feel free to write those questions down, and myself and Sam at the back, we can take those questions and ensure that they're incorporated into the session. We've also got a range of experts here with us. So we've got the Viva team at the back, and we've got a range of experts who are really working as part of the gas terminal project and are here to answer questions both on safety but other issues after the meeting as well. Obviously, we are focusing on safety, and safety has been a part of Viva Energy and the Geelong refinery for over 70 years, coming up to 70 years. So I'd like to introduce Dale Cooper, who is the refinery manager, who will talk a little bit about how we deal with safety at the site currently, and then we'll be introducing Rob, who will talk about safety as we develop this gas terminal project. So Dale.
All right, thank you very much, Jo, and welcome everyone. Very much appreciate you spending time here with this evening. So I thought maybe to get us kicked off and really focused on safety this evening, that we would talk a bit about, well, what does safety mean to Viva Energy, and be quite honest, what does it mean to me? And I'll start with at Viva Energy, safety is our core value. And you might hear a lot of organizations or a lot of people will say, you know, safety is our #1 priority. I actually take a little bit of exception to that, because I think priorities change, right? They can change in our personal lives and our business lives, but core values never do. And it really is about that commitment to our employees, our contractors that work on site, and all of our stakeholders, from our community to our neighbors to all the regulatory stakeholders that we have as well. So talk a little bit, so what are our objectives? It really is to ensure that we have no harm to people or the environment. And that is just absolutely fundamental to everything that we do every day, and we've been doing it for 70 years now. In the context of the refinery, which is an operating facility, so it's how we operate it, how we maintain it, how we modify it over time for changing requirements. And for a project like the gas terminal project, it's about how do we design in safety, how do we then construct it, commission, operate, and maintain it over its life cycle. So it really, truly is woven into every aspect of everything we do. The other aspect as well, how's that, a little bit better? Good, all right. The other thing as well is a fundamental belief in that all incidents are preventable. And I purposely choose the word incidents and not accidents. Accidents are like acts of God. I walk out there and I get struck by lightning, right? But we do believe that by the way that we design and operate and maintain our facilities, that we can design out incidents. And then through the way that we train, how we hire, train, and work with our people, that we absolutely can prevent incidents. Now, one of the means that we do that is something that we refer to as our Advanced Error Reduction in Organizations, the acronym AERO. And that is our behavioral safety program that we use at the refinery every day, and in fact across most parts of our business. And really what we're looking at there is our business really depends on people, right? And how do we set them up for success such that we can, what we refer to as execute our job every day flawlessly. And that really does get into the psychology of how people work together. Many of you may have heard your slow brain and your fast brain. And in fact, one of the habits that we have at the refinery is you never ever run at a refinery. You always walk. It slows you down, allows you to engage your brain, and allows you to think through challenging operations or situations that you may face. Now, that's how we deal with it inside of Viva Energy. But we also operate within a very comprehensive, complete regulatory framework as well. And we are the largest major hazard facility in the state of Victoria, so designated by the regulatory authorities. And that then places quite a significant amount of regulatory oversight and requirements on how we operate the facility. The key agencies that we work with is WorkSafe, so a lot for personal safety. The Environmental Protection Agency, so that's how we interact with the environment, air, land, and sea. And then Energy Safe Victoria, so that is how are we maintaining our assets, so that pressure containing, to make sure, the way I like to say is that we always keep the oil in the pipes where they belong. One thing that we are required to do is to continuously monitor all of our emissions. So as you may be driving past the refinery or you're looking out across the bay, you'll see that we've got a number of emissions points that are regulated, that we test on a periodic and ongoing basis to make sure that we always know how much carbon dioxide we're emitting, how much sulfur dioxide, all of the registered and required reporting that we have with these agencies. And what's really important is that we're completely transparent about that reporting as well, in terms of meeting all of our obligations on a timely and accurate basis with the regulators, and then making it available to anyone in the community that is interested in looking at our performance levels. The fourth, I'll call it element or pillar, is collaboration. And that is working very closely with the regulators. Regulations are constantly changing, so we need to make sure that we're well abreast of them and that we're proactively implementing improvements to our operations to meet those requirements. The other thing as well is having a mindset of what I refer to as learning from others. And that's from within the refinery or other Viva Energy facilities, but more importantly, other oil and gas industries as well. Viva Energy has one refinery. There's about 650 refineries around the world, and it's an opportunity through engagement with other refiners, through professional organizations. And we all have an obligation that when an incident occurs at a refinery, that we share the lessons learned from that. And then we have I would say, a moral obligation to then look at those incidents, try to apply it to our facility, and determine whether or not we too were vulnerable to a similar type of incident. And then finally, our aim is to absolutely, one, report, investigate, and then learn from any incidents that occur. And one of the things that, for me, is I would say characteristic of a healthy culture of safety at a refinery is our ability that everybody feels safe to come forward and report incidents, whether it be a small slip and trip as you're walking through the parking lot, or whether it be on the middle of night shift and a piece of equipment failed and we had some hydrocarbon release. So it is that quick, honest reporting, and then you bring all of the resources to bear that is needed. And to me, that when that reporting is constantly happening, it's an indication that, one, you've got a highly engaged workforce that really cares about each other, about the facility, and how we interact with our neighbors. Maybe just to close, I would say that one of my favorite sayings as well is when I meet with the workforce, I say that we want us to be the stealth refinery. And by that I mean we don't want our neighbors to hear us, see us, or smell us. And that's exactly what we want to do with this gas terminal project as well. So with that, maybe I'll pause briefly and ask if anybody has any questions on sort of our philosophy in terms of operating a safe, reliable facility. Sure.
You just mentioned that you want to be a stealth refinery, but yet this is quite massive.
I think you'd see it.
You know, it sticks out like dogs.
Yeah, so I would. So I would say when I say hear us, see us, or smell us, when I say see us, I would say large flaring events or large plumes of smoke. It is an imposing structure, both the existing refinery and the facility that we'll have built there as well. You'll see some renderings that perhaps put it in better perspective in the overall. So by that, you know, I'm not going to say that you're not going to see it if you're on the bicycle path or whatever down along the waterfront. It'll absolutely be visible. But we are very conscious about where we place the equipment and try to maintain. One thing that we do have as an advantage at this refinery compared to other facilities is the large area of buffer land that we have around us. So that'll be a key part to making sure that you guys understand how we're taking all of that into consideration. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, just a question about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, and that has a very important health and safety aspect. In fact, that's one of the major reasons why there's action around the world to reduce emissions. So a couple of things there. How does that play? Will that issue play into the safety issues that will be explored through the EES? That's the first one. And secondly, will you be recording and monitoring the emissions from the gas that's burned when it goes downstream? Because that's, like, unquestionably has a huge impact.
So for our first question is that yes, the environmental assessment process will take into consideration all of those concerns, I would say is maybe the best word to use. And we think, in fact, our project, because it's going to be co-located beside an existing refinery, has some unique differences from other projects that will help minimize that environmental impact. And then there is a framework existing today, and I'm no doubt that it's going to advance over time in terms of what we refer to as our level 1, level 2, and level 3 emissions reporting. So for those of you that are less familiar with it, so level 1 would be the energy that we consume to run the refinery. And in fact, about 5% of our crude oil gets converted into energy to run the refinery. We then purchase other forms of energy, primarily electricity. And of course, that is either generated from thermal plants, whether that be gas or coal, or more and more from at the refinery. Actually, a good proportion of our electricity actually comes from a wind farm, and perhaps in the future from solar as well. And then finally, your level 3 emissions are ultimately the consumption of the products that a refinery produce, like gasoline, jet fuel, and diesel. And then there are means in terms of then being able to offset those carbon dioxide emissions from those 3 levels through participation in other types of projects that have offset capabilities. And part of our sustainability program overall is definitely moving us in that direction of basically addressing the carbon intensity of a refinery, which is an energy intensive process to take that raw crude oil and turn it into finished products. Okay, go ahead.
You mentioned that as part of the framework requirements, you always know how much is being emitted.
Correct.
So what if there is an irregularity? What do you do? How do you provide a risk assessment regarding that? And you also mentioned the buffer zone.
Correct.
How big is that buffer zone? How does it compare to the size of the buffer zone for a similar refinery that's in Queensland, which has a 7-kilometre buffer zone around it? I'm looking at the diagram that was up there, and the pier is only about, I don't know, but it's very close to all of your oil refinery areas. So it might not be close to houses, but it's close to a lot of oil refinery storage facilities. So,
Yep, so maybe I'll work backward from there.
the
Okay.
emissions, what do you do if there's an irregularity?
Number one, report it. And then number two, correct it.
How do you have a risk assessment?
And then, I mean, once the emission has occurred or before the emission has occurred?
Well, you'd want to hope that you don't get the emissions, so the risk
Correct, yeah.
assessment is
Yeah,
there.
so part of our major hazard facility designation requires us to undertake a safety case review currently on a 5-year basis, and we're actually in the process of going through that now. And that is a very comprehensive review of all of our operations and potential incidents, and then the controls that we have in place to prevent them, and then should they occur, to de-escalate and contain them. So that's done once every 5 years on the entire plant. And then for a new facility, that is absolutely a key part of our design process as well.
So is there community consultation on that?
There is not on the safety case process. It is done with the right experts from within the refinery. It then goes to WorkSafe for their review. And I'll be honest with you, this is my first cycle through the Australian process. And I'm not exactly sure at what point on an existing facility there would be public engagement. Yeah.
Okay, and with the buffer zone, how does that compare? You said there was a significant buffer zone, but you didn't actually mention how big it was. And how does it compare with the Queensland buffer zone of 7 kilometres?
Yeah, so it would be certainly less than the 7 kilometres, because I've never been to the Queensland refinery myself, but I have worked on about a dozen different refineries and probably visited another 20 or 30. And I would say this would be in the top quartile in terms of buffer zones. If you look at a lot of communities and certainly North America, where a lot of big cities have happened to grow up around refineries, and quite often you would have either industrial or residential right at your fence line. And we're fortunate in that we don't have that. Yeah.
Well, with all due respect, you're putting something like this in a pre-existing residential area. So
We
it's not
do have,
retrospectively growing up around it.
We do have a slide coming up, I think, that Rob will be able to share there.
Zones and the like. I think Dale's talking one thing about the land around the refinery, and I think you might be talking about something else, Sanjay, or having a different meaning.
It's
Yeah.
a safety zone for a risk assessment for emissions or a flare or something else.
Yeah, and we've got a slide soon,
Very much.
and we'll get to that.
All right. I do know that, so thank you very much for your questions, all of you. So what I'd like to do now is I'll turn it over to Rob. He's our project manager on the gas terminal, and he's got content that he'll take you through this evening as well. All right.
Okay, thank you, Dale. I'm all mic'd up, so I can move around, but I've got to use some tech. So look, I think what we'll do is we'll just give a couple of minutes to go through the scope of the project. I know a few people here already know about it. There's some familiar faces, but there's some people here who I haven't met before. So I think it's worth just taking some time to talk about the scope. And I hope this is a pointer. It is. So really there's 4 major pieces of scope to us, and you can see on the diagram up here, this is the new project overlaid on our existing refinery. And here's the floating gas terminal, so that will be permanently moored at a new jetty extension that we're going to construct at the refinery. And then this second vessel here is an LNG carrier. And tonight, what we're talking about safety, and this is what we've heard from community previously, it's really going to focus around these two ships facilities. One being the gas terminal and the other one being the transportation of LNG. So that's one key scope. The second one is the pier extension. Then we've got a pipeline that connects from the gas terminal, runs along the new pier extension, across the existing pier, all the way, traverses across our refinery, up here where we've got some treatment facilities where we inject nitrogen and odorant so that we can smell gas. We're all familiar with that smell. And then an underground pipeline from there for about 4 kilometres out to Lara, where it ties into the Victorian transmission system. And for those who aren't familiar, as you come into Geelong at Hovels Creek, you go down around the bend. On the left, if you look up to your left, you can see a fence, and that's where the tie-in location is, up there. So in a nutshell, that's our project. Is there any questions around that?
Are the ships identical? Are they actually identical?
They're very, very similar. So
the picture that's in there is not representative of what's going to be happening in the Cryo facility?
I'm not sure. I'd have to have a close look at it. The FSRUs, the floating gas terminal, and LNG carriers, they take some different forms. They're ships, so they may look a little bit differently. But all that the floating gas terminal is essentially an LNG carrier with some additional process equipment on board.
And we have done some further work about what it will look like, and that's further down in the presentation. So this is initial, and we're continuing to develop and to really nut out what this will look like, and we'll show you a more realistic image of the terminal from various points.
But the scale shown here is representative. They're about 300 metres long.
Nice to have a scale on there, actually. I was going to say that's a relative scale, but it'd be really nice to have an actual metric scale on there of kilometres or metres or however it is.
Yeah, so the vessels are around 300 metres long and about 50 metres wide, and the existing ships that come into the refinery are around 275 metres, I think. 250. Yeah, I think up to 250. I think it's a bit.
No, according to marine traffic, there isn't anything over 250 that goes in at the moment.
Okay. We'll confirm that. Any other questions? All right. So, what is LNG? It's just natural gas that's cooled down. So, gas is hard to transport in its vapour phase, but if you cool it down to about minus 160 degrees as a liquid, then you can transport it in large quantities, which is what this project's about. And then how hazardous is LNG? Well, when it's at a liquid, it's not hazardous, and that's why it's cooled to that level. It's not toxic or corrosive, and it's not stored under pressure, so it'll come in on these vessels at minus 160 degrees, and essentially ambient pressure. Any questions around LNG? It's not LPG, so it's different to your barbecue bottles. It's different to what a lot of taxis are run on and that type of thing.
Just the second dot point in the second section, it evaporates quickly when exposed to air, and what's emissions from that? Do emissions come from that?
If it's exposed to air, so if you had a loss of containment.
Well, that's what it says. It evaporates quickly as if it's not an issue, but doesn't that fact that it is exposed to air make it an issue?
Well, if it evaporates, it's not toxic.
But it's CO2.
Well, it's not. It's methane. Is essentially what it is. Yeah.
It's just.
We obviously don't.
For the truth, this is weaselly. This stuff's that. Telling people that and leaving it at that is not telling the truth. And I heard someone talk about morals before and honesty and things like that. That's why I'm here, and I think a lot of others. So don't insult us by giving us weasel stuff. You know, it's kind of right, but it's not the truth in terms of what a lot of people's concerns are around emissions. right? Because that affects each and every one of us.
Yeah. So this would happen if you had a loss of containment, which you're not planning to do. It just describes what would happen to methane. It would evaporate and go up into the air quickly, as opposed to pooling on the ground or those types of things. So that's the purpose of it. So
Into a super saturated atmosphere that doesn't need any more. That's driving out the climate disruption we're having.
okay.
Yep. No? Am I wrong?
Oh, look, we're here to talk about the safety of a project,
So am I.
and so yes, Andrew.
What's the depth of the ship when it's fully loaded?
The depth.
Yeah. How
It'll
plan for it?
it'll be around 11 metres below the top of the
11 metres?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know what the depth of the shallowness of the entrance to the bay is?
yeah. It's around about 12, I think.
So you're going to have to dredge that entrance
No,
to enable the ship?
we're going to need to do some localised dredging around this area, because at the moment it's not that deep, but the remainder of the channel is deep enough to bring these vessels in.
By a metre. So what if it grounds? That's all I'm saying. What if it does ground? What if it does?
Yeah, and we've done a risk assessment. We can get to that, but that's very, very unlikely. And we bring in oil ships and other ships that have got draft as much as these. Draft. Took me a little while as well.
I'm curious why you distinguish it from LPG. What are the gas mixtures in LNG?
LNG's,
LPG is probably propane.
yeah, propane and butanes, and LNG's methane. So LNG's transported at cryogenic at minus 160 at, call it atmospheric pressure, sort of low pressure, whilst the LPGs are transported at high pressure, and rather than at the lower pressure. So and it's because of their chemical compositions. So yeah, I think some people anyway might think that LPG is the same as LNG, but they're different.
Where do you vaporise? Where do you vaporise the liquid in this schematic?
Yep,
Where's the vaporisation occur?
on the floating gas terminal.
Do you have any emissions around the vaporisation?
No, you vaporise it and it goes into the pipeline into the Victorian transmission system for use.
You don't have any emissions at that point?
No, you shouldn't. No.
There are emissions associated with compressing the gas in the first place, so it's more emissions intensive than just our normal gas at this stage, isn't it?
Yeah, there's some processing equipment.
Transport costs to get it here and everything, so it's
Yeah, so
more emissions intensive than our normal gas supply.
yeah, I'm not exactly sure about that, but that comes into the.
As part of the project, understanding the emissions is something that currently exists.
Yeah, so it's at level 1, 2, and 3 that Dale touched upon.
Sorry, can I just make a point on with the emissions, and you also, Dale, you mentioned that as well, with the emissions and the monitoring, looking at water quality and air quality, is it independently being assessed on site and in the water over at least a 12-month period prior to anything happening? Because that's the industry regulations, because I work in that industry.
Yeah, we're undertaking studies.
Yeah,
Over
independently it's being studied.
yeah, we've got an environmental consultant on board, and we've been undertaking studies since October of last year, and then the 12 months will finish in a couple of months' time now.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you've got a 12.
Yep,
Thank you.
yep.
Rob, I'm just conscious of time. Should we also really focus on safety and come back to these other questions?
Yeah, I mean, we'll be around afterwards. We're happy to take people's questions and discussions, so maybe we will. Okay, so let's talk about LNG shipping. LNG shipping's been around for, I'd say 60 years, quite a long time, over 100,000 journeys around the world. And I think a couple of key things that we need to bear in mind and understand is the design of these vessels. So they're essentially a double hull. So they've got tanks within the hull of the vessel, and between the hull and the tank is really thick insulation. So that's the only way you can carry this around at minus 160 degrees is to insulate it. And then the ships are really modern, the ships that we're looking at bringing in, and we're out talking to companies about this. They're all built less than 10 years ago, and they come with modern safety equipment. So there's detection, fire and gas detection, there's shutdown systems, there's firefighting equipment on board, and then there's the new high-tech navigational aids and the rest that they come with. So they're a very modern vessel as well. And the other thing, when they come into Corio Bay, they'll be escorted by tugboats. The speed's really low. I think it's about 5 knots as they come into the bay. And we're working with Ports Victoria around all of this as well. Is there any questions around the ships? Or I touched on anything?
I'd like to know, my question tonight is about the term buffer zone. Now, when those ships come in, they have to go around Pivot Point. There are 2 buoys, they have to go in, it's quite narrow. And from where that ship is to where my kitchen is 350 metres.
Yep.
So I'd like to know what buffer zones have to be around. I mean, I'm just amazed that something like this could be within 350 metres of my kitchen. And there are others all around North Shore who are in similar area, quite close to this. And those 2 buoys, it's a narrow area, and that's, I guess, one of the worst places that it's the narrow point you've got to go through, so it's the most likely place to have an accident. What protection is there for people like us who are all within, say, 500 metres of a ship like this, please?
Yep.
And what
We'll get to that.
regulations are there, please?
Yeah, sure. We've got a slide, probably in 2 more, I think, that talks about, and we've got some contours, and we undertake risk assessments, and then you can plot the risk around a facility or anywhere really, and that's recognised by governments and industries and used for planning purposes and all that type of thing. So
There are regulations, aren't there?
Yep. Yep. So we'll get to that.
Okay, thank you.
So hopefully we can answer that. Any other questions around LNG shipping?
I'll ask it now then, Rob. On the LNG ships, are there any limitations being put on the type of tankers that you're allowed into Corio Bay or into receiving? I notice in some earlier photos that we've gone through in presentations, you've showed moss tankers. And I notice in the photos so far, you've got membrane tankers only.
Yeah.
And I also know there's a different, I guess, perceived or realised hazard potential with moss tankers versus membrane. And in the Gladstone port, for example, moss tankers aren't permitted at Fisherman's Landing, but membrane vessels are, just due to like some inherent safety issues. Will we have any other similar limitations imposed on this facility as to what ships can deliver LNG to the FSRU?
At the moment, no. But I would say that we're in the early stages of our safety design and assessment at the moment. So we're in what we call front-end engineering, and then we're about 50% through that. So what we're going to present tonight is really the first part of the safety, because we want to be transparent and get out there in the community, and we said we would. And then as that progresses, things may change, but we haven't considered that at the moment, Garth.
Rob, if I can please.
Yep.
In an earlier slide, you mentioned to us that you were going to put limitations on tankers that you could have no older than 10 years. So you do have some framework around the tankers that you're thinking about using, or you alluded to that in your earlier statement, and now you're answering the question by saying you haven't covered that.
Yeah, I was talking about the permanent floating gas terminal here. So that one will be less than 10 years old, because we're out talking to companies and they put forward the vessels, so we know what vessels they're proposing and we know all the details. What Garth was talking about was these carriers that come in and bring the LNG, transfer it over to the gas terminal, and then they disappear and go out and pick up another cargo.
Why is it good enough for one and not good enough for the other if they're both going to be in the same spot?
This one's permanent and this one's a lesser time. But it's a good question. I'll follow that up.
How long
Yeah.
are the LNG tankers there for?
Unloading takes around 24 to 36 hours. And we're looking at between 15 and 40 ships per year.
It just seems inconsistent that you can stipulate safety on one tanker and another tanker that's exactly beside it not have the same requirement. It's just bizarre.
Yeah, and there'll be some reasons for that. And look, I will look into it. I think one thing is we're in control of this vessel and purchasing it or leasing it, so there'll be a contract with us, and then how LNG is shipped around the world is up to a number of companies.
Because you dictate who comes into your terminal. I mean, nobody's
Yeah.
going to come into your terminal if you don't contract them to ship your gas around.
Yeah, and we've got some partners as well. So, but yeah, it's a good question that Garth raised. I'll look into it.
Sorry, with what you're saying really is you don't have much control about the ones that are coming in, and that.
It's probably more that we haven't considered it to the level that we've considered this one.
Of ships that come in into the bay at the moment are registered in Liberia or Marshall Islands because they have the poorest standards of safety. Now, this means that if you're not taking any notice of this, we are in a far more dangerous situation. When you said safety, Dale said safety was so important.
Yep. And it is, and I think it's more that we haven't considered this vessel as much as we have the floating gas terminal at this point. It's a good prompt and we'll look into that.
Fair to say that there are procedures that will be in place in terms of vetting the ships that are used, the criteria for the ships that are used that we hire to bring LNG into the bay. It's just that there's still a lot of work to do.
But you're just saying, and what I'm reading here is that vetting process is going to be different for the ship that's coming in versus the one that's stationary there. Well, that's what
I guess this is a different role to the process. Not that there will be any less focus on safety, but we're talking about one that's parked and one that's moving and has a different role. But it's not saying that we're any less concerned about the safety of the shipping overall.
Well, that's not how I read it, Rob. I mean, you've got a very clear definition of what is required as a stationary vessel that's there 100% of the time, yet you're leaving an envelope very wide open for what's coming in for part of the time, which to me seems it doesn't have the same safety rigor applied to. Or you're allowing yourself some wiggle room to stipulate a vessel at a later stage.
I think we'll look into it, and I don't think we've got anybody here who's an expert on shipping regulations and laws, but I'm going to look into it. I'll get back to you, because we've certainly put a lot of time and thought into where we're going to contract this one. There's going to be permanently moored there, and these ones that will come in and offload and go. We will look into it, and I'll get back to you. So let's move on.
Excuse me, looking at the larger scenario of climate change, and it has been mentioned here already this evening, what assurances can Viva give us that we will not be processing fracked gas from elsewhere in this country at your facility?
Yeah, and we haven't looked into that level of detail yet as to where we're going to source the gas from.
Do you propose to do so?
We're not sure where the gas is going to come from, and there's a few things that need to be sorted out before.
The answer to my question is no at this point in time.
We haven't considered it to the level of detail to be able to say yes or no.
Thank you.
Just wondering about the using the seawater. Does that go back into the ocean warm, or how does that happen?
Yeah, so our plan is to send the seawater, which is cooled, from the gas terminal into our refinery, which will then warm it up and then discharge it under our existing EPA licence. So it would go back into the bay slightly warmer than the bay, but slightly less than what it's going into the bay at the moment.
And what if the refinery closes for any reason?
Yeah, we're looking at alternative dispersion models as well for that.
Where are you going to get the heat from?
Well, as I said, we're doing the engineering around that to see how we can do that. So, you know, we got some good news as the refinery a few weeks ago, so we're there until 2027.
Lifeline, really.
Potentially.
I mean, that's not an economic model going forward, is it?
No, we probably need to satisfy ourselves, so that's why we're doing some work around it. And that'll be all part of the EES, and that's considered in the environmental effects statement that we'll issue.
But that also impacts on your safety case here.
The seawater reuse.
Well, what we're discussing here, well, in terms of your heat balance and the way that you're managing your energy flows.
Yeah, it'll impact how we run this project, no doubt. So we'll consider it as part of the EES, but we are working on it.
The chemical composition of the seawater being released, is it actually just seawater, or is there going to be some minor contaminants that might be in there? Chlorines and things like that.
Yeah, so at the moment we dose the seawater with chlorine as we run it through the refinery, and to go through the FSRU it will need to be dosed with chlorine as well. We won't have to put twice as much chlorine, or the discharge won't be twice as much chlorine into the bay. We monitor the chlorine and it'll be within the EPA licence that we have.
But you need to use a certain dilution of chlorine for it to be effective in the role it's got.
Yeah, so you need residual chlorine.
You've got not just your oil ships, but also your gas ships coming in. You've got the potential for an increase in the release of chlorine because of the dosage that you need in order for it to stop the bacterial growth.
I'm just really conscious of time, and tonight we really wanted to focus on safety. We've got a lot more material.
But this is safety of our bay, Jo.
Absolutely.
And can I would like to ask whether if we're on a timeline for something that's so concerning to all of us, and I think that public discussion is better than individual discussion, because at least everybody hears the questions and the answers. And I understand you're on a timeline, but is everybody else here who's concerned about where they live, are they on a timeline as well?
Absolutely, it's an important issue, and what we were hearing was that safety is one area that the community really wanted to focus on. So if we could just park that question and come back to it if we've got time, and really we'd love to be able to go through where we are up to at the moment with safety, and then come back to these other issues. The EES is a really long process, and we've got various themes that we want to focus on and share with you, and we can't cover it all in one meeting. So that's the intention tonight, is to really focus on safety, and if we've got time, we can come back to other issues.
Yep.
I'd just like to make a comment. The Climate Council have done a lot of research that just showing the risks of health impacts, especially with cooking gas and the asthma effects of children. There are several misconceptions about gas. In reality, gas is far from clean. It is a polluting fossil fuel. So I'd like to see if you could comment on, and Dale over there might like to make a comment maybe. World bodies are saying no new fossil fuels. Now this is a new fossil fuel project. Just like a comment perhaps.
Yeah, I'm happy to make a comment, and this project is one of the pillars for it is that Victoria is a large user of natural gas, and our natural gas supplies are starting to drop off, and the forecast is that Victoria is going to be a user and a large user of natural gas for a period of time.
No, well, I disagree that the state government got subsidies to turn households. They're getting, I think it's 250,000 households are going to be turned on electricity and away from gas, and the state government are putting up the money.
Yeah.
So,
Look, the government agency AEMO, they're the ones that forecast the energy use, and that's who we're using as our basis, and that's the basis. If that changes, well that changes. But you asked for a comment, and that's my comment. Is that?
sorry, sir, but the world bodies are saying no new gas or no new fossil fuels. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. All right. We might move on. So we've talked about a lot of these already, the safety features. It is highly regulated, as Dale touched upon. There's a refinery that's highly regulated. This floating gas terminal, it will be highly regulated by the same regulators. And really, we need to, at this stage of the project, we're undertaking some risk assessments, and detailed risk assessments are a key part of design development and project development. And I'll talk a little bit about the risk assessment process in a little bit. And then we've had quite a few questions. We thought we'd put a whiteboard of some questions up there if we didn't have a lot of questions going from the floor, and we'll answer them in the next few slides as well. All right, so risk assessment. And this is where it becomes scientific and mathematical. So it's not up to me or you or somebody else to do it, but there's a process that you undertake. And there's professionals out there who are risk and safety engineers, and they're the ones who we entrust to do this work. And it's accepted by industry, governments, regulators. It's used for planning purposes. And you use computer models that are built up over years with historical data to assess the risk. And how is risk calculated? There's two parts to risk. There's the consequence of what happens, and then there's the likelihood. And you put those together and you get the risk. So the way I try to explain this sometimes is if you've got an airplane flying in the air and it landed on the Geelong West Town Hall, the consequence would be catastrophic. Right? It'd be hundreds of lives would be lost. But the likelihood of that happening is so minute that none of us even worry about that, right? So that's the consequence and the likelihood coming together for a low risk. So we've got to talk about both things. And that's what a quantitative risk assessment is, or a QRA. It's a tool often used within major hazard facilities like ours, and it allows us to assess that risk. And what it does is it can present you with a number, essentially, or some contours of risk at various distances from the hazard, which in this case is an LNG carrier or the gas terminal. Garth.
Rob, I'll kind of open up something you just said there. And I do it kind of a little bit for the benefit of the discussion, but you mentioned an example of the plane falling out of the sky Geelong West Town. One of the key things is to why that's not considered necessarily a practicable kind of scenario is that because there's mitigations put in place around flights of planes, air traffic control, flight zones, minimum heights, that sort of thing. So my key message is not to pick on your scenario there, but to say that there's risk in everything, which I think you're trying to say. But what mitigations are put in place to minimise that risk or make them less likely is really the key thing that comes into all of this. So when we're talking through, you know, the risks and the contours and everything, can we elaborate much more on what mitigations? Because as you know, the mitigation actually drives the outcome of the risk assessment. So if we can talk specifics around mitigations, like Coralie mentioned before, around the proximity of her kitchen to the shipping channel where the tankers will come in, and it's actually not 350 metres, Coralie, sorry to disappoint you. You're at about 260 metres from that shipping channel, so you're even a little bit closer. But what's really important to us before we say, you know, that's not a credible scenario or the risk is negligible, we need to understand what mitigations are being put in place to enable you to arrive at that solution.
Yeah, and I think if we roll back a slide, and we've mentioned some of the mitigations, there's design. So how these vessels are designed, the double hull. For example, the fact that there's leak and gas detection and automatic fire suppression on board, that's part of it. Then you've got the fact that the low speed, the escorts through the channel as well, so your processes and procedures, and you've got trained personnel with it as well. So there's some of the mitigations that come into play that impact the output of the QRA. And then a little bit more about risk assessments, and I think this is really important because what is the process? And really, you've got to identify the hazard, and we've talked about a few here tonight. Then you've got to understand the frequency, the likelihood and the consequence. Again, we've touched upon that. And then that gives you a risk calculation. And that's it over here. And then you need to ask yourself, well, is that tolerable or not? And then what is tolerable? So, and then if it's not tolerable, well then you go back here and say, well, we've got to reduce the risk. And then that might be, certainly in our case, where we're at in the design phase of the project, well, what other design modifications can we make which will mean that we lower the risk and get it down to a tolerable point? So there's this loop here that you undertake, and that we undertake. So they're a really powerful tool so that you don't just go and design something and think that'll be okay. You go through the rigorous process, get a technical scientific number as a basis, assess it, and then take any action that you require.
Fully understand all the QRAs, fully understand the risk assessment procedures, the actuary work that's being done and all of this as well. However, risk assessment is for the time of the operation of the plant or what's happening. So what's the future of some of these things? And I'm thinking in particular, I'll give an example of the spoil ground that's shown in the EES. So we've got potential for high cadmium polluted or contaminated soils to be put on that spoil ground. How is that going to be encapsulated, or how is it going to be contained with the rising sea levels that are going to be happening, or with the rising water table, which will be saline and affecting the bay as well? So rather than just focusing on the next, what you hope is 25 years for the refinery, we're hoping it's not going to be that. But we're looking at 100 years. How much cadmium is going to be leaking out? How many other problems are going to be left behind? Long term, is the risk assessment longevity based or current?
Yeah, no, I think that the EES is a risk assessment of sorts, and what you've just talked about with the spoil disposal ground, that fits in there. What we're talking about today and what we want to talk a bit more about is with the LNG carriers and the FSO.
But isn't that a legacy as well? What we're doing is we're providing a legacy for our, for the future.
Yeah, and that'll be captured in the EES process.
What's to stop me as a future refinery or LNG terminal manager coming in and changing, let's say for example the shipping requirements that come in here. I've got a struggling gas import terminal and I want to make it more viable by reducing my shipping regime, right? So I come in here and I want to choose a cheaper tank here that may not necessarily have all the same safety agreement, all the same safety mitigations that we agreed to in the original QRA. What stops me from changing that?
Well, there's a safety case that you've got, so if it's captured in there as to how you're going to manage it, you need to do that, or else you...
Is it captured in there? Is it captured in there, or is it not captured?
Well, we haven't done the safety case yet, but then I think your question's similar to the one earlier about the LNG carriers, and I'll do some work and get back to you on that.
Yeah, but I'm looking at something that's embedded in the architecture that can stop us backpedaling here on So let's say, for example, you go ahead and you say, well, maybe I'll just, maybe my import ships will have the same safety rigor as my standing terminal ship there. But in the future, you know, I'll appoint a new refinery manager who wants cheaper ships, who wants something that's older than 10 years to make this whole process more viable in the future. What's there? What external process outside have you got to stop it, or what sort of assurance have we got that that any of these mitigations won't be circumvented in the future?
Yeah, let me look into it, but I know that we've got a regulatory framework here in Victoria that you have to comply with as major hazard facilities. We do it today with the refinery. This new project, it'll have its own major hazard facility licence, so it'll have a safety case. Then there's the EPA and there's the other regulatory laws that we have to abide to, and that's going to be no different with this project than anything else. I'll look into the shipping side of it for you.
But you haven't answered my question. Where is that embedded in this architecture? So does it have to go into the safety case? Is that where it becomes binding, or?
Well, a safety case is binding.
Okay, so if you impose on here a minimum safety standard for import shipping, it needs to go into the safety case for it to be binding.
It might be captured somewhere else in maritime rules and regulations. So that's why I want to just get back to you on that outside of this.
In terms of capturing it in the maritime, in Australia's current maritime safety case, we have ships that are coming in here that are virtual rust hulls, you know, that are accepted in other terms and that aren't accepted in other jurisdictions. But because our maritime regulations are so shallow, yeah, they're allowed to come in here. I just don't see any rigour or any embedment of what we're asking for here, particularly around safety and shipping, being embedded in any of this architecture.
Yeah, okay. I'll get back to you on it. I can't add any more at the moment.
Will that answer be shared with all of us? Because I'm interested.
Yeah, sure. If you're registered and we've got your details, no problem.
With the hazard identification process, will that be open to a number of stakeholders and the public? And with the frequency and consequence modelling, where does that data come from? And then with your risk mitigation, there's I suppose a hierarchy of the technique you employed with, I suppose, elimination being the top one, which is obviously not happening here. And then I suppose engineering and administrative processes. Will that all be outlined in the EES, where the data is coming from for the analysis and the, I suppose, hierarchy of the risk mitigation techniques that you're employing?
I'm not exactly sure what will be in the EES yet. We're finalising the
Well, I suppose
safety.
will that be made public? Because I suppose
the EES will be made public.
Is, I suppose, scientific in, I suppose, the software that gets used to analyse it, but all of the inputs are human selected. So I suppose it's about understanding where that data is coming from and what assumptions have been made and where that, I suppose, precedent data has come from.
Yeah, and it's highly technical and complex, and we're more than okay to share that with people. I don't think it's a topic for a forum like this, but certainly, you know, I've offered it to Garth. You know, if he wants to get into the real detail of it, I'm more than happy to take him through it, and anybody else who wants to get down into the detail, because it is very technical. But yeah, we're more than happy to do that.
Rob, just on this slide, could you just explain, give us an overview on what tolerable risk means?
It's a good question. Maybe we'll go to the next one, because that's how do you know whether you're in the right spot? And then that's where the contours of your risk help you decide that, because we use, it's called HIPAP 4, I think. And that's recognised within industry and across government organisations as being a standard that applies. So if you meet their standard, that's where we're aiming. So these are some of the hazards we've considered: onboard incidents, severe weather events, loss of containment from either the floating terminal, the LNG ship, or on our pier. collision from port traffic or the LNG ship into the floating gas terminal, and an incident while at berth with the floating gas terminal operating. There's a different mock-up. There were some questions earlier. 2 different type of vessels.
That's your Moss.
Yeah,
Tanker.
there's your Moss. Okay, so we talked about the modelling and it giving you contours and giving you an answer and a basis. So this is what the contour map for the operation at the gas terminal with an LNG and operation. And the question about what is a tolerable risk, these contours give you the risk, and the risk reduces as the further you go away from the facility. So the orange line here, the most concentric, is that's industrial. That's the benchmark for industrial. So, and then the light blue or aqua, depending on how your eyes are, is the contour for planning purposes, outside of which you would build a hospital or a school or a childcare centre. And you can see that here it's just impinging on the edge of our refinery, but the general public isn't impacted.
Just seems strange to me because you've got also an oil facility or an oil terminal next to that again, and your concentric rings seem to ignore the fact that you've got an oil terminal next to that as well. I mean, the envelope here doesn't seem to be holistic.
Or the adjacent terminals facility which Viva doesn't run or operate. So you've got a cumulative effect potential here.
Yeah, so that's that. That's a good point. So our safety and risk assessments will cover what we're talking about tonight, but there's some pieces that we haven't done the work on yet. And that includes the rest of the pipeline, it includes the rest of the facilities, and then we haven't done the work yet on the interaction between the refinery and the gas terminal, or the gas terminal and the refinery. That will be done in the future. But we'd heard that people wanted to talk about safety of the gas terminal and the transport of LNG, so that's what we can present now. We're more than happy to come back in a couple of months' time when that work's done and present further.
It just seems really poorly developed that you're taking a very blinkered view to what is presently there. I mean, looking at those concentric rings at the moment totally excludes the fact that you've got an oil terminal.
And I just said that we've still got to do that work. So we're halfway through our early development engineering, and that will be done by the end of that engineering phase.
But these concentrics, these circles, you're only putting them around where the ship will be moored. You're not putting them right near where the ship will be going right through the bay, right round Geelong.
That's our...
Those circles you would include the hospitals and childcare and all those other things because they're so close. And I mean, of course, what we've got here too is what used to be called terminals. I don't know what I've forgotten.
Quantum. That's there.
Is right there, and I mean that's one of the most dangerous places in Geelong. But those circles, I mean, we're in North Shore, we would be within, say, the orange circle, I reckon. We're in that very close circle.
But there are different risks between this facility here and the transport down through the channel, and we can get to that next if.
Because we're more risky because the ships are moving, so we're in a riskier zone than this.
That's not what the analysis has shown, and this has more higher risk involved in it because at this point you've got high pressure gas as you're operating, and really that's the main difference. And there's two main differences. You've got high pressure gas and it's permanently moored there, whilst the transport of the gas is a short time frame, 20 times a year or 30 times a year, and low pressure gas. So when we actually did the model, you actually don't even get a contour line with the transport of LNG.
You probably should correct also the caption at the bottom of that photo, just to say that it doesn't include other facilities that are presently there, because that is a very misleading picture at the moment. Because you're saying you've undertaken this HECAP analysis to level 4 to the exclusion of all other facilities that will be operating in that area.
We've stated here that the risk from the floating terminal, the LNG ship and the pier facilities are localised. That's what's happened.
Come out in that caption there under your photo.
We've said preliminary findings, and I've just told you that we haven't considered it yet, and we will. So
is that statement wrong then? Is your HECAP number 4?
There's nothing incorrect with it.
So to me it doesn't seem to make sense. There's something missing from your analysis there.
I don't think there's anything missing from this analysis. We've told you that we haven't considered the impact of a refinery incident on this or the impact of this onto the refinery yet, and we will do that.
So you're conducting an operational quantitative risk assessment with blinkers to everything else that's on there?
No, we're presenting the information that we've got at the moment, and we've said that we'll come back and we can share that information later when we've done it fully. We put this meeting out there and advertised it 3 months ago after some of the initial engagements, and where it came across that people were very interested in this new facility and the LNG carriers. So we thought, well, by June we'll have some data on that, which we do, and we're presenting that now, rather than waiting until September or October.
Rob, it might help for the discussion. I mean, the circles that you're showing here are very specific to a scenario. You say it's the worst case scenario. So could you run us through what the scenario details are that lead you to this series of concentric circles, and what mitigations were taken into account to limit these safety zones, so to speak? Can you run us through that? Because that may help the discussion.
Well, I think the mitigations are around the design.
But what's the scenario? I mean, this represents the risk of something, say we're talking about fire, explosion, fatality. It represents something, and it will be related to a specific scenario that says coupling at the LNG unloading arm disbands, and you've got 2,000 litres of LNG hit the water, and we do or we don't get rapid phase transition, we do or we don't get explosion locally through pressure contours. We have a safety system which is an auto leak or a leak detection and a safety cutout on the arms, gas detection, blah, blah, blah. So there's a whole risk that there's a whole lot of, I guess, scenario definition and mitigations that go into producing these circles. And so for us to get confidence that these circles are accurate and reflect the exposure that we'll get as public, we need to understand what that scenario is plus the mitigation. So when we show here being the worst case scenario, it would really help if you could talk us through what this scenario represents with these circles.
Yeah, so these contours aren't about one scenario. It's a build-up of all of those scenarios and then put together as a risk. So that scenario that you talked about, plus others and others, that's what goes into coming up with these concentric circles. And Andrew, you might be able to, you're an expert in this field.
Right, maybe a little bit in addition, but it's not very well put together. The process that's gone through here is to look at a range of different scenarios, different types of leaks from the storage facilities, from the process facilities that are on board for regasifying the LNG. You have what's called a range of different release sizes based on the historical data that I referred to earlier. And from each of these different scenarios, you can build up a profile of what size of release, how quickly it will release, and what the extent of the damage, the extent of the damage and the likelihood that people will be in the area to be impacted by it. So in building up that overall picture, and there's many hundreds of calculations that are done to simulate that, these contours provide an overall picture of the whole of the consequences that can result from the different scenarios, and there's probably around 10 key scenarios that are in there.
Can you run us through the most significant?
The most significant ones relate to the the regasification process and the discharge from the pumps, getting releases from that, and also from the gas loading, the loading arms.
So the ship-to-ship transfer is the most significant?
Yeah, the ship-to-ship. No, not the ship-to-ship transfer, the transfer after regasification, because the ship-to-ship transfer is again at low pressure. So the extent of your release is actually going to be very low because it doesn't have much driving force behind it to go very far, even though it's liquid as opposed to gas. So that's really what's driving the contours. The controls that are being incorporated, as Rob referred to, you've got isolation of inventory, you've got the design of the vessels, you've got your automated shutdown systems that have been incorporated. There is some further aspects of detailed design that have yet to go into this model that will actually bring those contours in a little bit as they go and define what the isolatable sections are. And what that means is when you try to confine a release and the amount that will come out, you shut valves in order to reduce the volume of gas or liquid, whichever it is. And that hasn't been designed yet, so they've assumed the largest volumes rather than what might be end up in actual design, and that will bring those contours in a little bit.
Can I summarise what I think I heard? There's two
Sure.
driving scenarios. One is the high pressure discharge from the pumps, so it's a liquid still at this stage, and one is like what would be considered a pipeline, a natural gas pipeline equivalent leak.
It just seems bizarre to me that you've done a lot of work here. From what you're saying is you have done a lot of work to understand the limits of those rings there based on a detailed safety analysis, and you've completely ignored what's beside you.
No, as Rob said, we're not ignoring what's beside us. As you've rightly pointed out, we have done a lot of detailed work, and to get to this point, we have not yet been in a position to go and look at the interactions with the refinery, or from quantum or other things. And as part of,
I'm even talking about your own marine facility right next door. What if you have a problem loading or discharging a ship that's within those concentric rings there? Another vessel. How does that fit into your model?
Yeah, and if you see there, the orange concentric ring essentially goes around the LNG carrier and the floating gas terminal, and then as you move out, then you get closer to the pier.
And what I think I've heard, Rob, is that this scenario considers operational safety through normal operations and doesn't consider other external factors that James is talking through here around, nearby contributions, or otherwise, I'll put it straight out there, like intentional damage to the ships while they're at port versus just an operational high-pressure gas pipeline leak or a high-pressure liquid.
So you're talking about terrorism?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we've done a security risk assessment on that. We have to do that as part of our refinery anyway, so we work with the federal government on that type of thing. We've done a... What's that?
Sorry, I was a little bit rude. I said, that must be fun, working with the federal government.
Right. You can ask Dale up there, he'll probably talk a little bit more about this one. But we've done some work to understand whether our existing processes and controls that we've got in place are appropriate to include this project. And they are. I don't know, Dale, do you want to add more? So Dale's our security manager.
I'm not the guy that sits in the corner and doesn't say much and really wants to say much. And there's reasons for that, right? Is that we don't want to give away what controls and measures we've got in place. There's reasons for that. But there was a full security risk and vulnerability assessment completed. There's been two that have been completed in the last 2 years, so one on the refinery, which included the jetty, one recently for the LNG facility, given current threat context. So the outcomes of that risk assessment is basically what they've said, is that the controls and measures in place are adequate for the threat environment.
So Dale, just on that, if I look at, I'll leave a few things, just leave them lying right. But right now in the Port of Geelong, there is no restricted access in terms of approach or safety distances or restricted zones in any of the ports. So
physical barrier.
Basically, if I took from here, I've almost got 360-degree access to your tanker as it sits there. At the moment, there is not one security exclusion zone out there.
There are security exclusion zones, so they're regulated zones.
Correct.
So what I just said before is that there's no physical barrier, but there are regulated zones. So there's zones that you, as a fisherman or a pleasure craft user, are not allowed to go.
And what does that look like in an LNG environment? Because it's been very silent in all the interactions, and I guess as a frequent user of the bay, I will have my boat in and around there, around the water discharge and intakes and around there, and basically, you know, there's not much there. I will know, and I'll not full front, in 2008 and 2009, I was working on an LNG import proposal in the US known as Blue Ocean Energy, which was subsequently not proceeded with. And of all the safety findings in that facility was moved 1 mile offshore, right, to minimise threats of terrorism and exposure to public in the event of an intentional act, and also generic safety. And as you know, that in the US there is regulation oversight of all LNG import by the US Coast Guard. The US Coast Guard and the other governing bodies for that, which is like the Department of Energy, I can't think of their acronym at the moment, but effectively they define a safety zone around ships, and they have safety exclusion zones, and that's driven by a waterway suitability assessment, which ultimately says in this particular waterway, whether it's open, what's the population, what's the traffic, what's the public, is this waterway suitable for LNG traffic, LNG tankers? And then what mitigations do we need to put in place to make it suitable? Now, the generally accepted rule of thumb across the US, which has a number of LNG import facilities and now export facilities, and I will say that Australia at the moment, we don't have a single LNG import facility in operation. There's Newcastle, which is progressing. There's another one in South Australia, which is progressing. There's this one, which is progressing. But as at today, there is not a single LNG import terminal in Australia.
Export, which is just that in reverse, right?
So when I go back to the US Coast Guard and what they generally accept, they will have at least a 500 yard, which translates to about 800 metres of safety exclusion zone around the boat in, say, the Port of Boston, or if you look at another up in the northeast, which is Cove Point. They actually have a 2 nautical mile exclusion zone ahead of the ship, 1 nautical mile behind, and a 500 yard exclusion zone around it when the ship's in movement. And so they put all these mitigations, and again I come back to the mitigations because the devil's in the detail here. I mean, we've asked for what are the specifics behind this worst case scenario, and it took a little bit of while to flesh some things out. And it all comes down to the mitigation. So when as Coralie says, she's 200, 300 metres away from the shipping channel, which when you look at all these Coast Guard regulations in the US, they literally would have a string, including armed escort boats, Coast Guard with big machine guns on the front, protecting that ship as it transits through. And now we're talking, and as a resident of North Shore, couple hundred metres, 220 metres from that shipping channel, that buoy that Coralie mentioned before, is the closest house. My kitchen is 340 metres from that marker. And then you'll say that when we're approving these facilities in the US, and again, I'm US-centric, so I'll disclose that's why I know the information and my bias, they declare the first 500 metre radius around a ship as Zone 1, which is the most hazardous, and they exclude all sorts of things from there. Basically, you don't want public access within that Zone 1. And that's as the tanker's moving. And half of North Shore's within that Zone 1, nearly all of it. And so when we talk about mitigations, quantitative risk assessments and scenarios, we need to understand what that means. And this, you know, once we've fleshed it out a little bit, all it says is for a normal process safety incident such as a failure of a line from the discharge of a pump where you're relying on seal-rated valves, you're relying on gas detection, you're relying on operator response, and it says shut, 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 shut. So therefore my limited contours, right, from the outcome. But what we want to understand is what about these other things that are there and what are the layers? And I also understand that from a security perspective, we don't want to also disclose what all is out there. But as residents and as me, with my family, within 340 metres of these things going past, and I know Rob had mentioned in earlier meetings that we're expecting initially about 40 tankers per year of LNG as a rough estimate. I noticed today that number's kind of crept down to 20.
Yeah, I don't think I said at the start it'll be 40.
But
yeah, that's right. 20 to start with, up to 40. 40 is our max.
So we need to know those, what's there, right? And if I go back to Port of Gladstone again, which you said, oh, we don't have any LNG import, but we have export, right? We have those. We have requirements on pilotage. We have requirements for 4 tugs minimum to escort these LNG vessels, where only 2 are required for every other tanker. We have additional requirements for firefighting tug to be on standby and at location at Curtis Island whenever there's an LNG ship in dock. And we seem to be missing that piece of this puzzle because it is a real scenario and it's a real threat, and quite frankly, knowing that this is just some simple process failures, this doesn't go anywhere near giving me peace of mind that accurately represents the risk to the community.
I'll go back to what Rob said, and I think we're not far enough down that road to understand that yet ourselves. We don't understand that yet. We've got to get there. The work that we've done so far, and we've done a lot of work so far, there's still work to be done. You know, our maritime security plan, we've got an existing maritime security plan at the refinery that covers, you know, full berths that are there, that does give us exclusion zones. We get to know what the minimum standards or what government is going to set as exclusion zones for the FLNG facility. We don't know that ourselves yet. That's all got to come. We've got to resubmit our maritime security plan, and it's a government-approved plan. So they're the ones that tick that off. We can say, you know, we're going to have a 250 metre exclusion zone. The government will come back and say, well, actually, we don't agree with that. We want this. So all of that work is yet to be done. We do have, as I mentioned, you know, there is a current approved maritime security plan that exists
For crude oil.
Sits there right now.
For crude oil, fuel oil, finished product, but not LNG.
Absolutely. And quantum terminals. But they, quantum, sit under our maritime security plan. So I'm not sure that helps at all. I would honestly say we're not far enough down the track yet to understand all of those obligations.
Yeah.
We've got a fair way to go.
And that's, from a safety perspective, we need to understand that. So I guess this is an opportunity for us to voice these types of concerns to you, right? So you can take them, but, you know, having delved into this slide or this graphic a little bit more, this doesn't give me any level of confidence that this truly reflects the safety exposure to the community.
Yeah. Look, you know, security and safety are very similar, right? The only thing that I add is capability. So when we talk about consequence and likelihood, I also add capability. So what capability is out there? What exists? So we're a lot different than America. You mentioned the US. Explosives readily available. In Australia, not readily available. So that's what we talk about when we talk about.
Yeah, but we're looking at world's best practice here. Yeah, we don't want to be a Senegal or an Algeria or one of these places, do we? I mean, we're not looking at the bottom. We're looking at people who are setting the benchmark. Yeah,
and that's why we have government standards. The government are the ones that set the standards, and they're the ones that we need to please before we get this off the ground or water. Yep, definitely.
Thanks, Dale.
What does 5E-07 average year actually equate to? Like, what number are we looking at?
So it's 5 by 10 to the negative 7, which is 5 in 10 million.
Okay.
Sorry, again, because I know I'm more familiar with this, having worked through, but of what, right? That's an event rate, but what does it define the consequences being?
Is that one fatality? Or?
Is that one fatality in every 10 million years or one fatality in 5?
It's a probability of a fatality on that line per year. So 5 in 10 million in a year if you're going to be located on that blue line.
To the exclusion of all other risks.
Due to process safety incidents.
Yeah. And other. I mean, I still can't believe you can conduct such detailed modelling, excluding other users of that jetty.
Which we're going to do. That's going to happen. It's going to happen.
We're not excluding it. We haven't said we're going to exclude it. We just haven't. We've said we're not there yet.
Okay, so we move on to the transport, and the preliminary QRA finding is that the risk level is negligible. There's no contours registered. So there's no impact to community or residential areas. And that's driven by that time where the transport is happening. So 20 to 40 times per year at a number of minutes as it goes up here. And the fact that it's low pressure LNG. Those two things are different to being at the location at the refinery, and that therefore the risk is less.
You know I'm going to have a comment about this, Rob.
I'm sure you will. I mean, I think we covered it really, but yeah, go for it.
Yeah, but for clarity, this one you're saying that there's no risk, and I'll say North Shore, right, where we've got the closest approach to the shipping channel. It says collision with another ship, ship grounding, onboard incidents, and those have all happened, right? They are all incidents which have happened to LNG vessels, undeniably, right? I mean, in the Straits of Gibraltar, there's an LNG vessel that ran aground. There's been process safety incidents on the ships. There have been collisions, a couple of years, I think it was in the Suez Canal, there was an LNG tanker collision with a container tanker. So they all happen, and again, it comes down to these mitigations, right? Because you've assumed in here some things around it's the only ship in the channel at the time that it's being transited. You've also You've kind of just assumed those little list of scenarios. So I like the detail here. This is much more informative than it was previously. But if I put a scenario out there which is at the closest point, and I've said it's 220 metres from the shipping channel to their nearest house, it's actually closer to the shore and vehicle access and car access to the shore. We've got road, we've got car parking areas, and we've got other areas. So, at the risk of creating a scenario here, the scenario that I've got that I want addressed as a resident there is if there was to be malicious or intentional damage, the place to do it would be from North Shore, where you're 200 metres land-based from a ship, provides you easy access to get in and out. All of the modelling in the US and safety evaluation says that for an intentional damage of an LNG tanker, and this is across many studies, says that there's going to be a 5 metre squared hole created in the size of a tanker. It depends which study you look at. Some of them go up to 12 metres square. But in that scenario, the resulting outcome is a pool fire at least a radius 300 metres. It's between 300 and 500 metres. And so if I play that out, that says that I've got an LNG pool fire at the cliffs at North Shore, which would be less than 100 metres from people's houses. So that's the scenario that would get me comfortable that we do the proper risk assessment on and outline the mitigations that show actually it's a negligible risk. But I think what you'll do is if you do that scenario and you plot your risk contours, it's going to not be negligible.
Well, I think that plays into that security piece, right?
And that's what I'm saying. It's completely silent on here that you've not given us any reassurance as the public of what's being done to protect the public, because, quite frankly, LNG is a different beast to crude oil, right? And crude oil and even finished product, if there's a rupture or a leak, its behavioural pattern is a lot different. Its thermal radiation is a lot different. Its ability to ignite and set fire is a lot different, right? So generally I will say that crude oil and fuel oil and finished product, it would create a lot of environmental damage, probably no personnel risk or very limited risk to public, right? Really limited. You could drive your boat through it basically. You have an LNG pool there and it's a whole different risk scenario.
It certainly behaves differently, but it evaporates quickly as well, and the lack of pressure.
But your 300 metres pool is the generally accepted minimum diameter for an LNG tanker rupture through intentional damage.
Yeah, I think.
And you've got a source of
do you want to comment on the security stuff? I know a bit about it, but I'm.
If you're going to play out, you use likelihood. If you're going to use more likely scenarios, you've got Adelaide Airport and airplanes going straight across your house. So.
No, sorry.
Using a scenario that's never played out before.
You're introducing things that we've all moved into the area knowing, right? I'll say I accept the risk from Avalon. I understand the mitigations around flight controls and the limitations that are put on there and the security screening prior to people getting on planes, all that sort of good stuff. I accept the refinery operation that's been there for a long time. And by the way, I know I sound negative here, but congratulations on, guaranteeing the future for 2027. I think that does a lot for everyone. Okay. And so we accept that. But what's different here is that you're introducing LNG into Corio Bay, 340 metres from my kitchen, which was never part of the equation. It was never even reasonably foreseeable. Okay, so when we play these out, yes, we do need to consider things that you're introducing to an established area. It's not something that's been going for 50, 60, 80 years, and really you're not changing it. If you change a ship, you import a different crude oil from somewhere else in the world, it doesn't really matter because the risk profile doesn't change. The reality is you're bringing a new substance, big tankers, new type, with a completely different set of risks. And in many respects, less environmental damage from an incident. And I just talk safety, I'm not talking other items that have been discussed here. But it's higher consequence to people. Less environmental, but higher consequence. And
so maybe we need to do a little bit more work around the terrorism risk assessment, is what I'm hearing, Garth.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So maybe we'll take that offline and we'll talk through that.
We want to understand what it looks like, because right now you can use the bay, right, just about anywhere. And if we go to, again, Port of Gladstone, if you go to west coast and you start going to the Pilbara or the northwest shelf, they have got safety exclusion zones around there, and they're different. There's no government standard policy. Right, okay, so Gladstone 220 metres.
Yeah.
Okay,
different.
You can't approach it.
Different facilities, different locations.
So I want to understand what that means, because right now I can go and fish all of the, water inlets and outlets from the refinery, as people do, but what does it look like with LNG? And that's what's been kept silent. We just saw a process safety quantitative risk assessment outcome, and that was it.
Yeah. So I'm hearing, You want more information around the terrorism threat.
Yeah, and restrictions.
Yeah.
And
understand
like the fishing community, right? What does it mean for them?
Yep.
And I mean, every day there's guys fishing at your water inlets and outlets, right? And so what does it mean for them?
Yep.
Right? What does it mean for them who fishing in their boat, who are moored just outside on the edge of the channel, fishing into the channel just off the refinery pier? There's no community impact being discussed, and again, that community impact is safety, right? It's excluded because of safety, so it's remiss of us not to address it in this forum.
Yeah, so we've engaged Recreational Fishing Vic, I think that's their name, and a couple of yacht clubs as well around the use of the bay as well. But we'll get some more data here and
Also said that exclusion zone that we've got right now, is it the exclusion zone that we'll have with this facility? The exclusion zone will be bigger.
It will be bigger.
It has to be.
And is that being openly discussed with the boating authorities and the big wreck fish? So it says, hey, you can't come within 200 metres of this, or 500 metres when the ship's in transit.
It should be, Boating Victoria map currently has your restricted zone for the refinery on it.
And it's not large.
No, it's not, but that's the standard of what government has set. And again, the government will set the standard, and we'll work with Boating Victoria and our local boat ramps to provide data and maps on where that exclusion zone is. It's an advertised exclusion zone. It should be already, say you've got boats, you launch a boat at St Helens or I'm picking on one, lime burners, there's maps there currently that have the exclusion zone around.
And we shared with the Lagoon Yacht Club what the future exclusion zone may look like. So,
And what was that number?
so we've done a...
200, 500 metres?
We just updated the map.
But we've got a map that has a predicted zone on it.
Can we
Just
share that? We'll put it online.
No, I don't have it tonight.
And
Essentially, it's and it goes out a little bit further around there, and we yeah.
And that applies to a berthed vessel, not a vessel in transit. What about exclusion zones in transit? Can we get that as well?
I can't give it to you yet. I haven't got it. Not yet. I said before, we are nowhere near that.
Yeah. No, I guess I've been unintentionally disruptive. I didn't set out things by the way. When we say, I know Rob had a slide there when we talked about regulatory authorities and regulators, and I know very clearly across the different LNG export terminals we have, there are completely different exclusion zone requirements. And I know that Victorian government has not had an LNG import terminal, and we don't have any regs that specifically address LNG import terminals. So who sets this exclusion zone? When you say government, who is it? Because it's not a federal body, because it'd be consistent across the...
Department of Home Affairs, Maritime and Aviation, Irrigation and Maritime, always get around right away. They're the ones that approve the maritime security.
As a federal?
Federal, yes.
But they approve your security plan, so it's like a safety case. So you propose a security exclusion zone and they accept it. They don't specify a specific limit that you have to comply to. It's similar to a safety case where you suggest a safety exclusion zone, they accept it, and then hold you accountable through enforcement to that standard which is accepted in your permit. Is that right? All right. Important point there. Can we be involved in some discussion around what you're suggesting as a suitable exclusion zone?
Yes, sorry, I'll go back a step. So happy to share what we've done already around what. But it's too early for what we haven't done anything in regards to a vessel going on the channel. That hasn't been done. And I'm quite happy to take it up with QGC, Shell, all of those guys and see what they're doing as well.
Sandra.
Two observational things, particularly with Liberty. So the first one is you were talking about the draft of about 11 metres for the ship fully loaded with
Around that.
Around,
Yeah.
and with an around approximate depth of the channel of 12 metres. But the narrow neck between, and also there's a shoaling area right there, which means that it's a very limited area for ships to actually enter Corio Bay. So we've got the possibility of tides. We've got the possibility. We've got the ferry coming in twice a day and other cargo ships through Geelong ports as well. So if there's a low tide, extreme low tide, who gets right of way? Does that mean that the floating gas facility could realistically be anchoring outside of Corio Bay, waiting for its turn or for a tide that will allow it to enter? The other thing I wanted to make as an observational point is that the residence time for water to flush out of Port Phillip Bay is 400 days. Now, because of the narrow neck and the shoaling, which is very narrow, and it also means that the depth at the neck of Corio Bay is very much reduced, that flushability or residence time is going to be greater than 400 days. So any pollution that is released into Corio Bay will not flush out with the next high tide. It is going to take a significant period of time for it to first of all flush out into Port Phillip Bay and then out through into Bass Strait. So to take into account, it's not a question, but the bathymetry is really not your friend for Corio Bay in any way, shape or form for this facility.
Yeah, and that feeds into our environmental studies that we're doing. So that's where it'll be that the bathymetry's considered. I think to your point about the management of ships in the channel, we have similar issues at the moment with our crude vessels. Sometimes they can't get in and out, and therefore they have to wait. But what we bring in is governed by the port authorities, and we've worked really closely with them in terms of the size of the vessels and how we can bring them in, and with the pilots and the like, to make sure that it is all possible and practical, and they're happy and comfortable with what we're proposing in terms of the vessels that we're looking to bring in.
Well, I'm just conscious that we're running about an hour over. I know that some people do need to get out of here. Perhaps we should press on. There are going to be other opportunities. We'll be back to talk in more detail as we have more studies playing. So, we're not trying to shut you down. We'd just like to get through this, and if people want to leave, can leave. We'll be around for a little bit longer to chat further.
Yeah, so this slide really talks about the next steps, and it talks about the additional QRAs to be done, including the interaction with our refinery and vice versa as well. So we're not at the beginning, but we've only done a little bit, and there's a lot more to come in terms of risk assessments and safety assessments for this project. And we're happy to share those results as we continue. So whether that's in another couple of months or 3 months or 4 months or however longer it is. Security, Dale. I think we've talked about this. I did want to mention it, and I think we've covered security in a fair bit of detail so far. Okay, so tonight is one part of community engagement and receiving feedback. And as we go through the EES studies, there's other opportunities, and we've had the scoping document open for comment, and that's recently been finalised. And then there's also when the EES is submitted. But we'll continue to engage with the public. We have events like this every month. This month it's about safety. Next month, Joe, what are we talking about? Amenity. And the month after. So we'll continue to have more of these formal engagements, but then we're also doing informal stuff. We're out at shopping centres and the like. And if you've got specific questions and queries, by all means, drop us an email. Go on our website. There's lots of information on there that's getting updated pretty regularly, and we're more than happy to answer any of your questions.
Just in terms of the timetable, Rob, I mean, there's been a lot of issues raised here. I mean, the reason why we've got all the time is that there's a lot of concerns that we don't feel are being addressed. So if you set the topics for the timelines going forward, that's likely that's going to continue. So why don't we frame the session by the concerns or the questions that we do have?
Yeah,
and then I'm a bit convinced we'll be able to do it in an hour.
Yeah, and that's what we've tried to do. We heard a lot of concerns about safety, and I think there's some people in the room are more concerned by that than others, perhaps. But so that was the purpose of today. I think the last one we talked about the EES process because we'd heard concerns about that. We're very much happy to address people's concerns and what they want to talk about. People may want to talk about different things though. So this is the first one that we've had a presentation like this. Other ones we've had sort of stations where people can go to, that most interest them and where their interest lies. So we're open to different things.
Please let us know formats and so forth. We're happy to take that into consideration as well. This is evolving and the EES is a long process and we want to be engaging and share studies as they're evolving.
I just want to ask one last question, if that's all right, based on the core values that you introduced. No harm to environment. As a company, how deeply is Viva committed to the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN?
We are, yeah, absolutely.
But how deeply?
We think that society is changing, their expectations, and as a company we're going to have to change with them.
Is it on your website?
Yeah, do you want to, sorry, I'll introduce myself. I wasn't planning to speak, but Lachlan, Chief Business Development and Sustainability Officer. So we report against the Sustainability Development Goals in our yearly sustainability report. So for the last 2 years we've done it. So we pull out a number of the key sustainability development goals that are relevant to what we do. We also report against what's called the governance review identification framework, so that's more about a holistic governance. And then we do what is now becoming the industry standard, which is the TCFD, which you might have heard about, which is about forecasting climate scenarios into the future and what risks that brings to your business and how you operate. So if you look at our sustainability report, which this year is part of our annual report, so you just download the annual report from the website, that's where we publish all that information.
Okay, because I haven't been able to find it.
Yeah, we can send you the link.
Do you have an independent evaluation of your success with sustainability development goals, or is it all in-house?
So, I mean, I guess these are long-term. So the horizons you talk about are short, medium, and long. And short is sort of industry standards around 3 to 5 years, medium is about 8 to 12, and long is generally 2040, 2050, depending on what you do. So in terms of assessment against those, we haven't really hit any of them yet in terms of where you're going for them. But what we do is we use external consultants to build up the risk framework. We set the strategy out in the sustainability report. We publish metrics, so if you want to go look at our scope 1 and 2 emissions or what we do and reporting over a number of years, you can see all of that. That's also audited to the regulator. So all of that information is there, and we'll continue to develop. We're like a lot of companies, it'll get more detail as we go forward. Next year's sustainability report will be better than this year's, and we'll keep getting better for sure.
So can I ask that you put the link to that on everybody? Can everyone who's registered, can we get the link to the report, please? I'm sorry, Neil.
Yeah, there's a lot of useful stuff in there. I might give it a minute. But one take home from me was there's a line in there to say that in terms of emissions reductions, that none of the procedures or new process was put in place because of the future uncertainty of the refineries in Australia. I mean, I can get it the words, but it's more or less along that, which I sort of wonder. I suspect uncertainty is going to be around for a long time.
So I think, are you talking about, do we have goals around emissions reductions and intensity of the refinery? Yeah, I guess at the time we wrote the sustainability last year, there was a very good, we were in a situation where the refinery was threatened about its viability going forward. And as it's been indicated tonight, we've got some security to 2027 and out to 2030. So maybe there was a sentence in there that was addressing that. I guess that uncertainty has gone away. What I would say about the refinery, and Dale admitted it, and mentioned earlier, is that it is an energy-intense facility it uses. It's the top 10 gas and electricity user, so it does have a large Scope 1 and 2 footprint, and that is the reality of running oil refineries. So we're doing work now about what we can do about that over time and what that can look like in terms of addressing that over a period. But it will be a long-term thing to the refinery, right? While we're running that refinery, we'll work to make it more energy efficient. We're working on the gasoline master plan at the moment to do that. We're putting in some upgrading facilities as we do turnarounds to improve energy efficiency, but it's a long-term game to get that done. Thanks.
Okay, I might actually stop talking for a little bit and hand over to Joe to wrap things up. But thank you for your time, and as I said before, any questions that you haven't answered tonight, shoot them through on our website. There's details there where you can get in contact with us, and we're more than happy to keep up the conversation. So thank you.
Thanks, Rob. And thank you everyone for coming. It's been a long night and a really worthwhile discussion. As we indicated, this is very much part of the process, and we're only halfway through. We're going to have a range of sessions. A couple of dates are up here on the site, on the page. We've also got all the details on our website. We will continue to update the website. Really encourage you to look at our Facebook as well. But one other thing I will just mention tonight, thank you, is that we've really focused on safety this evening, but there's a variety of studies that are underway. One of the next ones that we're really working on at the moment is the social and business impact assessment. Now that's being run by external consultants. They are looking at the positive and negative impacts of the project, and if you would like to be involved, I would really encourage you to contact Hannah and Jess, and you can be involved in that study as well. So please feel free to take their details or let me know at the end of the session and I can pass them on to you. But it's been a really good session. Thank you very much for your involvement. And as we've indicated, that this is the beginning and we really hope that you'll continue to be involved. Thank you.
Could you just read out the email addresses up there, since we haven't given you a big reading?
Yeah, sure. So it's Hannah, HANNAH .Kennedy, KENNEDY @acom.com. And then the next one is jessica.whiting @acom.com. ACOM or ACOM? M for Millie. Great. But please, I can forward those details on after the session as well. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.